So, welcome to Grace Episcopal Church. This is, for me personally, an extraordinary opportunity because I am sixth generation Grace Episcopal Church. That also means that y'all are going to have to indulge me a little bit because I can't really tell the story of Grace without bringing my family into it. I'm going to try not to do that, but sometimes when you've been here as long as our family has, it's inextricably compounded in terms of the stories. Before I get into it, since we do have a couple of others trickling in, I want to thank the folks from Grace that helped make this happen, and specifically the two gentlemen who were wearing the neon jackets outside to help you with parking, Bill Rieger and Charles Cochran. Thank you, gentlemen, for helping. Now that we don't have the co-op building next door, it can get a little confusing about what our parking is and isn't. Some of you asked about coming in the back door or the front door. That is technically the front door. But I think we probably have as many people coming and going by the back door as before, so there's not a wrong way to do it. I handed out on the front end these blue folders for those of you who came in last. Charles, there are some right on your rail if you don't mind getting those to anybody who, if you'll raise your hand, Charles will get you one. The history of the Episcopal Church. Oh, really? That's okay. Y'all can wave me back. And now that means I'm staring at me in the camera. That's just not good. I handed out the blue things. A friend of mine named Richard Quinn is a historian, and he put together these flyers. At some stage, there were 6 or 7 Episcopal churches in Maury County, and there are 2 that still have the doors open. So as you wander around the county and do some back road exploring, as I know some of you do, I wanted you to have this to talk a little bit about each of the churches. Right now, Grace Church, on the northern edge of Maury County, is one of the churches that's still in operation. Come on in, folks. And St. Peter's in Columbia, which is on West 6th Street. The other church that gets some limited use, and it's a wonderful experience if you have the opportunity, St. John's Ashwood is down near Mount Pleasant. It was a plantation church that the 4 Polk brothers built, literally at the middle of their plantations. It was also unique at the time because African Americans worshipped in the same structure as whites. It's a beautiful churchyard, and once a year on Whit Sunday, which is typically, I think, the last Sunday in May, they are open for a service. It's a very, very special service. Last year, it was rather extraordinary. Our bishop from West Tennessee, we have 3 sections in the state, is African American. And she insisted as a speaker at the St. John service that we also do some community work to tell the African American story. So there was the Maury County African American Historical Society had a speaker, and she spoke, and to have an African American bishop speak in a plantation church is a rather extraordinary juxtaposition and a good step. So keep May in your mind because that's an opportunity to do that. I'm also going to encourage you, because I've had some questions. You all have heard us talk about this before. You're going to see hopefully the mic won't come off. This little book, Spring Hill, Everyone Has a Story, is at the library. It can be checked out. It is a collection of essays that were written mostly by people who were raised in Spring Hill. It was done 20 years ago. And if you want to get a feel for Main Street and the churches, this is an awesome place to start. Dana and her crew are working on a revision to this book, and then they are also working on a brand new book about Spring Hill. So, yep. So everybody, we have an awesome, as you all know, we have a great library, but the history section at the library. So let me start with a little bit of background. This construction on this church was started in 1875. The city of Spring Hill was established somewhere between 1808 and 1810. The first settlers came in about 1808, in part because they had received land grants after the Revolutionary War as payment for fighting in the war. But that property line for western North Carolina went pretty much to Duplex Road, east-west, and it was called Old Military Road. South of Old Military Road was Indian Territory. North was where it began to be settled. And then in, I believe, 1806, and Tom can correct me here, the Indian Treaty went away. It was either bought out or given up. But that opened up the southern part of Spring Hill as we know it now. And the settlers began to come into this area. The original settlers came in 1808. I think the first child born here, white child, of course, born here was 1809. 1810 was the post office. And then you began to see the neighborhood be mapped out. Henry Wade actually drew a map of Spring Hill. They decided to call it Spring Hill because everybody went to the Spring Hill to get their water. So there's reasons for the name. In the meantime, anybody want to take a guess what the population was in about 1875? It wasn't 60,000 people. 34 people? Slightly more than that. 100, 400, roughly. Now, that wasn't city limits because we didn't have city limits. That was pretty much everybody in the area. 400 people. To give you context, when I was in high school, and I am not 200 years old, lest I look otherwise, it was about 1,200 people. Many of you came in the 80s, early 90s, and it was still maybe 10, 12,000. Much of the growth, the explosive growth, has been in the last 20 years. We can blame Saturn or GM, but I think it really has more to do where our geographic positioning is. GM at the time that they came, Saturn when they came, put out a poster, 2-page newspaper ad, had a map of the region, the state of Tennessee, the states surrounding us, and it had sort of earthquake zones around it. And I believe that the numbers that it quoted in that poster were that something like 70 to 80% of the U.S. population lived within 600 miles of Nashville. That's why we've had our growth. Besides the fact that we're great people, but that's an aside. So, all right. This church has always been a small church, and we strive at being the best small church we can be. We've had fits and spurts of trying to grow and be much bigger, and we are growing now. I think we have 80-something members, if I'm remembering correctly, 30-something on a regular basis. We also take great pride in being a family church. And we have generations like myself who've been at this family. Bill Rieger's kids have been raised in this church, and now his grandson is being raised in this church. And it gets a sense of continuity that is a pretty phenomenal feeling. I call it Grace Chapel on many occasions because that's what it's called when the idea for an Episcopal Church in Spring Hill was put together. If you look at the Presbyterian Church, it was started in 1888. So about 15 years after this one. The Methodist Church across the street, the original structure was about 1846. So we kind of fall right in the middle. We're also a bit unique because we come out of the flower garden of one of the big historic homes in this house. Some of you may know as you go south on Main Street, 2 doors down, there's a big brick house that's known as the William McKissick House. It was about 30 years old when the McKissick family decided to donate their flower garden for this church. The men that started this church, excuse me, 2 of them at least, Matt Campbell and Campbell Brown of Ewell Farm, had both fought during the Civil War. Sorry, getting instructions to move back. But it's far better if I'm not in the picture. Matt Campbell was my second great-grandfather, and Campbell Brown was his cousin. They came back, they had fought in the Civil War, they were in their early 30s, and they were starting families. If you look at this church, it's called Grace, and yet we have St. Paul's and St. Peter's in Franklin. Why weren't we a saint? Why did we get Grace? It's my opinion, and I think I've seen this documented somewhere, I just can't necessarily always locate things, that those men wanted it called Grace because of the grace they felt at this community and that they themselves had felt after the war. This area was decimated during the war. And by the 1870s, when this church was built and those 2 men were building their young families, this area was beginning to boom again with agriculture, innovative agriculture, not just the large plantations, but inventions in terms of plows and equipment and things that we would look at and go, that's not much of an invention, but it was for them. Ewell Farm, Richard Ewell, Campbell Brown's stepfather, had added sheep and racehorses and Jersey cows And in fact, if you drive by Jimmy's Cleaner, or you ever stopped at that stoplight, there's a historic marker there that talks about that. So it was really coming back together, and they felt like, I believe, that this was a gift of gratitude for what they had come through. The bishop that was approached was our second bishop in the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church operates on the premise that bishops are apostles through a lineage. Our first bishop, the first bishop of the Episcopal Church, who had come to Tennessee in the early 1820s and begun to establish the church, was a man named Bishop Odie. Bishop Odie had died in 1863, just before the war started. His successor was Charles Quintard. These men that founded this church had fought, obviously not with the deceased one, but with Bishop Quintard. So there were connections. There were personal connections that caused that to happen. Quintard had actually come from the north, I believe, Connecticut. He came down here to be a doctor, and then he joined the 1st Tennessee as soon as the war started. And when he finished, by then he had met Bishop Odie and decided that he wanted to be a priest, and then became the second bishop for the state of Tennessee. He's the man who consecrated this church. And in fact, in the entryway, you can see a letter from him doing that. So the church was started in 1875. Any bets on how much it cost to build this church? Okay, who's read that? Somebody's read the history. I think that's what we call it cheap, but that's okay. $1,800, which is the equivalent of about $40,000 in today's dollars. Much of the church is hand strewn. The pews that you're sitting on are hand done. They're square nails. The floors are original. And they feel pretty solid, right? The church is going to be celebrating 150 years in 5 years, so we'll look for a big celebration at that point in time. Going back to my notes here. The interesting thing about Matt Campbell and Campbell Brown, and again, Tom can add to the history of this, I suspect that both of those men suffered from PTSD. Campbell Brown's family had struggled with mental illness for a number of years, and in fact, he wound up being the second generation in his family to die of suicide, at a relatively aged age. Matt Campbell had lost a leg. So that was some of the stuff that they were bringing to trying to establish a community. I'm not sure why the architect was chosen for this church. I suspect it's because both Matt Campbell and Campbell Brown had houses that were built 2 or 3 years before this church, and they called upon him with this design. He was a famous architect, and in fact has, if you've ever been on the Vanderbilt campus, I think the old gym was built by him. But this is a very unique design. If you look at the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church, this is a unique design, and we'll go into the building in just a bit. But they call it technically Norman and Gothic influence. I'm not an architect, so I can't explain what all of that means, but as you look around, you can certainly see that the design. 3 of his buildings are on the Vanderbilt campus. So we've been through a little bit. I would also want to remind you that Beechcroft Road, this road here, was a dirt track. It wasn't Beechcroft Road. There are pictures from the 50s from when my mom was here that it literally was like a 1-lane dirt track. And at some stage, when they straighten out duplex, this section of Beechcroft will go away again. So it's going to be interesting for the church. So very different feeling for the community. I mentioned that there were 6 Episcopal churches, 2 remain. I will also say that when I was growing up, we would park on Main Street to come to church. We never had a parking lot, but we never really worried about it because you just parked on Main Street. Can you imagine doing that to now? Social media would erupt with disdain over what we were doing. But that's what we could do. Understand also that US 31 Main Street was a road that was requested by this community. They needed to be able to transport these agricultural goods and products that they were producing. And while it was a dirt road, it was still a road. So I often laugh a little bit when people complain about traffic on 31 because this community fought for this. And in fact, in the late 1800s, just after this church was built, they went to the powers that be. And remember, at that point in time, most roads were toll roads. They were privately owned. It so happens that Campbell Brown, who helped start the church, was one of the major investors in this road. The basic messaging to the powers that be was, we will give you $3,000 if you will run the road near Spring Hill. And we'll give you $10,000 if you run it through Spring Hill. You see where the road wound up. So again, when everybody talks about, we just need to widen it, we need to take down, well, we paid good money to get that road built there. All right. In the early years and for a lot of its lifetime, Grace didn't have its own vicar or its own rector. That's what we call a priest. We had supply clergy, and when there wasn't supply clergy, members of the congregation, the church never closed its door. In fact, I think it was closed this past Sunday, and we did a Zoom meeting because of the weather, and that is the second time that I can remember in my lifetime. We do our best to keep the doors open at all times. Anybody notice what the color of the door is? Anybody know why it's red?
Sign of Episcopal churches.
It is a sign of Episcopal churches, except apparently we were a little off kilter because we kept it green for a number of years. The red door epitomizes Christ's sacrifice, Christ's blood. It also served as a symbol of sanctuary. The guidance was that if you were in a war zone, which often the world is, that you could be in that building and soldiers were not allowed to enter a building with a red door. So when we got away from the green and went to red, that was a part of the symbolism in that.
What did the green mean?
I suspect, honestly, it's a bit like the Tootsie's purple. It's kind of the only paint color we could find at the time. I would love to tell you that it's fields and agricultural and growing, but I think it was much more functional than that. The congregation size has always ebbed and flowed over the years, not only with the community, but because at one point in time in the late 1800s, this community had, I'm trying to watch Dana and stay in line with the camera here. This community had 6 schools. Remember that population of 400 people. Education, schools and churches were 2 of the first things that the founding fathers and mothers of this community built. It was important. Branham and Hughes, where the children's home is, Ferguson Hall, across kind of down from Fain and Goat, was one. Up the road where Mom and me was a girls' school called the Beechcroft School for Girls, which coincidentally several of the men who started this church helped to found. It wasn't affiliated with the Episcopal Church, but it was those same individuals who wanted women to be educated. That was a bit unusual at that point in time. Building. I noticed a number of you looking around when you come into this building, and I know that for as many years as I've been coming here and many others, there is something about this space that is extremely special. We always hope that when we have visitors that you all feel that sense of peace in this structure in spite of the motorcycles and the trucks that are going by. The altar at the front was carved by a man named Johannes Ertel. He was actually an artist in residence at the Columbia Institute, which was another girls' school in Columbia that these gentlemen had helped start in the mid-1800s. If you get up close, and please do come up close as we wrap up, it's grapes. It's the communion symbolism. There's a story in the 1930s. There's been 2 major fires in Spring Hill and several minor ones. The story in the 1930s was that Miss Odell, who played this organ, sent her daughter up here. She lived 2 doors down. Sent her daughter up here with an axe and said, if the fire gets to the church, cut out the altar rail. She didn't have to do that, thankfully. I fibbed. The altar rail was carved by T.S. Morton. He was a teacher at Branham and Hughes. The altar was carved by Mr. Ortel. This is what happens when I go off script. That altar rail that we just mentioned was carved out of a single tree. from Mule Farm. You don't find that craftsmanship much anymore. Campbell Farm, Mule Farm. Everybody know where Mule Farm is? I see some nods. So if you go out Depot Street, it turns by the railroad tracks. If you go straight, you would be in their driveway. Don't do that because it's a private home. But Mule Farm was often the picnic church gathering place for members of this congregation. He would also hold his famous horse sales there. Some of you may have noticed up near Fifth Third on 31, there's a sign for a horse named Star Pointer. Down around the industrial property south of Ripavilla, there's a sign for Billy Direct. There's some theories that if the state of Tennessee hadn't outlawed gambling on horses, we would have been the second capital. We would have been the bluegrass of Tennessee instead of the bluegrass of Kentucky. Horse racing was a really big deal. And so these horse sales would draw people from all over the country. And the women of this church would go serve the people that came to those auctions. The rail up the stairs to the altar is obviously newer. It's a memorial to a man named Alan Campbell. He was one of the first confirmants, as in within the first 5 years of the church being open. He also was a lay reader for many, many years and led worship with morning prayer. In 1914 and 1919, his 2 children were baptized in this church. Catherine served as treasurer here. There are several memorial windows, and you're actually getting some of the nice lighting through our newest window right here. So I want to go around the church, and again, feel free to wander when we get done. As you come in through the narthex, which is the front door, there's a stained glass window just to the right of the door. It's called the Mitchum window. It was donated in 1995 to honor the memory of Mary Polk Mitchum and Millard Mitchum. Mary Polk Mitchum had been baptized in this church, confirmed in this church, married in this church, and was buried in this church at the age of 83. Her husband had married into the Episcopal faith. He was Church of the Nazarene. And he married into the Episcopal faith, and he was buried out of this church at 104 in 1995. That window, when Mary and Millard married in this church in 1930, the church was filled with dogwood pulled off of Sugar Ridge Road. Some of you have driven out Sugar Ridge. Excuse me. Their daughter, my mother, was an active member here until her death in 2017. My dad was buried from here in 2020. This is part of why it's a very special place to me. My parents spent over 25 years living overseas. And while we attended non-denominational churches, because you often didn't have a choice where we were based, this was the church that my mom would always talk about as her home church. There's a running joke that she could be traveling in the cathedrals of Europe, and somebody would say, "Where are you from?" And she would say, "Spring Hill, Tennessee." And my dad would say, "Nobody knows where Spring Hill is. Why are you doing that?" She said, "Because most people in Spring Hill will never get here." So that's that strong base. The stained glass window in the back, if you all want to shift just a little bit, there's a little bit of lighting coming from the road. That's known as the Estes window. It was donated in 1888 by the children of Beechcroft School and was given in memory of Henry Bacon Estes. Mr. Estes was one of the founders of the school. The window contains the crown, which is a symbol of royal authority. It's also been used to designate the crown of life. The palm tree in the center is most often used as a symbol of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Used by the Romans as a symbol of victory, palms have been used by the church as a symbol of Christ's ultimate victory over sin and over death. Above the Estes window, there is a small round window. Thank you, Bill. It has a descending dove. The dove is a Christian symbol for peace and for the presence of the Holy Spirit. That window and this window to the right on this side were donated by Libby Rawlings in memory of her husband. The window right behind Tom Powers there is the only remaining, one of 2 remaining original windows in the church. Those windows actually would open on both sides to allow for airflow. There's one here and one in our sacristy. Let's see. The Odell window, next to the organ, and we are going to talk about the pipe organ, don't think I've forgotten, is called the Odell window because Annie Lou Bearden Odell was our organist, and that was given by her children. Clearly, the harp is a symbol of the music that she played. It was made in Exeter, England, and shipped to the U.S., and it is a little bit different than the other windows. It's hard to tell in this light, but there's 3 bars across it. It's designed a little bit differently, and clearly none of the new windows can be opened and closed. There are the window behind you, Vicki. That is actually our newest window, given in memory of a very special young man named Chad Bodine, who attended this church. Chad had multiple disabilities and was nonverbal, but he was very much an active member of this church and in fact became our bell ringer on a regular basis. When Chad passed away, Chad would sit where Vicky's sitting and he would stare out the window at the traffic in the co-op that used to be there. And so when he passed, his parents wanted to do that window. If you look at that window, you can see 2 red cardinals. Chad was a twin. And so the cardinals represent he and his twin brothers. You can also see a puppy, Kaylee, that's wearing a service vest to represent his service dog. He also loved to watch the squirrels and the cats, and so you see the animals in there. And the colors are representative of autism. For any of you who have children or grandchildren with autism, we incorporated those in as a way and also incorporated them into the color scheme of the church. So I think that window was put in, 2 years ago, Bill? It was an interesting job. It's the first window that many of us in recent memory have seen taken out and put together. The original window, we had a carpenter come in and he matched the measurements because we had to have an exact fit. And when the frame got to the stained glass person in South Carolina, she said, "This is not even." And we had to explain that it wasn't even because every piece of that curve was hand put together. So there were pieces that were the size of my pinky that were put together to form that arch. It was all hand done. The nails were all original. It also took the carpenter and the construction folks pretty much a half day to figure out how to get the window out, because we couldn't figure out how the hinges worked for them to open, to tilt originally. We haven't used them in so long, nobody knew how to do that. You clearly just didn't want to smash it and take it out. So the original window is actually in my garage, or at least part of it is in my garage, because the architectural history of that is really quite interesting. Let's see, we talked about the door, the organ. Excuse me, find my notes on the organ. Oh, good Lord. Bill, I may need your help on the organ. It is a pump organ. I think it's one of 2 in the state. It is still operational on Sundays. There's a little room on the outside. If some of you parked across Beechcroft, they would hire somebody on Sundays to come pump the organ. Every once in a while he would fall asleep and the organ would have to kick at the bottom and wake him up. I think he got paid 5 cents, as I remember. The organ's been repaired multiple times, and it's one of the things that we take a great deal of pride in. I believe it was put in about 10 years after the church was consecrated. Does that ring true, Bill?
Yeah, we're not exactly sure, but that's our current thinking. It was made by the culture company who are from Kentucky. This is unique tracker style. Anyone miss it?
Anybody want to jump up and play? We'll wait. It's actually, one of our organists, Ainsley Fleetwood, used to say that it's actually that he didn't have to go to the gym if he'd come on Sunday to play the organs, because it's quite the physical workout to get that played. We've had some really good organists, and we've had some organists who, I'm pretty sure the organ went, "Why are they sitting on this bench?" But I think that's true of any church music program. And I just found my notes. The organ was built in 1884, so 9 years after the church was built. We do have events here. We have been on the Christmas tour. We've had some musical events. If you have an opportunity to come listen to the organ, it's a very unique sound. Excuse me. Electricity was installed in the 20s, and it included an electric pump. So our young man lost his 5-cent a day job to do that. The children of this church, we can't really talk about this church without also talking about the gardens. Because it was built in the flower garden of the McKissick house, a lot of the bulbs that used to be out front were original and would come up. Daffodils would come up. And the children of the church would take the bundles of daffodils and sell them to raise money for the church. Not really sure that would go that far these days. But it's a wonderful thing that it's not just the structure, it's all of that. I'm trying to look. These 3 windows at the altar, which are, again, difficult to see with the lighting, are all original to the church. They all contain a lot of church symbolism, which I think is pretty apparent to anybody. So, is there anything in particular in the church that you all would like me to address? I can see hands in the back, but I can't see them clearly, Bill.
I was going to mention the roof structure. If you want to
Oh, yes. Anybody, does the shape, if you look at the roof, does the shape of the roof look like anything? The bottom of a boat. Yeah. Now, I have been told for years that is because early Christians worshipped under ships. It was a safe place, not ships, under boats. It was a safe place. I have also since read recently that is a myth. I'll leave God to determine that, but I think the design, it's a wonderful design. And again, it's all hand done. So, the other thing that we have not mentioned, and it is actually the only mystery in this church, is the bell. The bell is dated England 1839. It gets rung every Sunday, and Bill may ring it for us in just a minute. We have no idea where it came from. Now, if you do that too hard, the bell is likely to come off. That has happened too. And we've had squirrels get up there and chew the rope. There's some stories that the bell may have actually come from a church in Williamsport that's on your list, because that church was desanctified shortly after the Civil War, and this bell came into being. We have no evidence of where it came from, but to have a bell that's dated 1839, we probably shared it with somebody else at some point in time. The cushions, actually, that you're sitting on came from Advent Church, which is up in Brentwood. When they moved to a newer building from Nashville to Brentwood, we inherited their cushions. So even the things you're sitting on have history. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the term desanctified. Can you explain that process to us?
My understanding of that process is that basically a sanctuary building that has been sanctified and set into motion to be a church is undone because it no longer has the congregation.
But they just announced that they don't do what?
No, this was, as I recollect with St. Mark's, this was several years in the making. It was kind of if I remember correctly, a post-Civil War congregation went away and many people moved into Columbia. There is a church down in Williamsport where you can actually see a cornerstone of that original church, but that structure is no longer standing. Does that explain it? It's about as best as I can get.
So basically, if it's desanctified, they can do anything else with it.
Yeah.
Simply not.
Right. Churches in the Episcopal Church are owned by our diocese. So the members of Grace Church don't own this building. It was deeded over to the diocese. And so in theory, if at some stage, actually several years ago, when Spring Hill was going through its initial growth spurt, there were some suggestions that we physically move this church to another location and more acreage, because we are somewhat restricted with parking. And there was a bit of an outcry about moving this church from this corner. My mother got tagged with some of that as being the rebel leader of the group of Don't Move Grace Church. As it turns out, interestingly enough, it wasn't my mother. It was other members of this community from the other churches up and down Main Street of don't take that landmark away from us. So she was falsely accused, but I think she took great pleasure in being the rebel. Yes, sir.
What are the walls constructed of?
Good question. I don't know that I know the answer to that.
They are lath and plaster.
So what will the install be on it? Do you know?
I believe nothing. We hear the outside. I don't think there's
So the question was, what are the walls made of? The answer was lath and plaster. And the second question was, what's the insulation like? And Bill's answer was nothing. And I think he's right. Honestly, you don't really notice it. I mean, granted, we have central heating and air, so that helps a lot. But even prior to that, these buildings are pretty well constructed. And you might be surprised if you got in there that you would find newspaper and all kinds of other materials that served as some form of insulation. Good question. I learned something today. Thank you for that. Other questions? Yes. Yes, you. It does not. Many of the members of this church, quite a few of them actually, are buried at St. John's Ashwood. St. John's Ashwood also houses the remains of several generals that were killed at the Battle of Spring Hill, or the Battle of Franklin. And it has, I can't remember how many, 4 or 5 of the bishops of the Episcopal Church are buried at St. John's Ashwood. Several other members, some of the original founding members, Dr. Hardin. Some of you know where the hair salon is across the way. That was Dr. Hardin's house. He was one of the founding members of this church. He's buried at Spring Hill Cemetery. Campbell Brown, I believe, is buried at Rose Hill. My great-grandfather was buried at Rose Hill. So we're kind of scattered all over. Unless we wanted to take the Purple House down and turn it into a cemetery. I don't think that would go well. Also a good question. Yes?
You mentioned when they straighten out this road here, they get a little side yard. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing to...
I can tell you what the talk is, what the reality may be a completely different thing. The game plan is essentially to bring duplex straight across from where it hits Main Street on the east side. It would come straight across and behind the hill where the co-op building was and hit Beechcroft. Old Military Road that goes back into the residential area would be dead-ended at that point, because you don't want those people speeding through the neighborhood. And this stretch of Beechcroft from Old Military Road to Main Street would become, I don't know what the highway department's term is, but defunct. There are some people that are pushing for the slab where the old co-op is to be a passive park. That would allow you to put some historical markers up. That is actually one of the highest points in the city. And so using that space, and if that was a passive park, Beechcroft itself may become parking for the park and for Grace. We're on top of it, is all I can tell you. The plans change constantly, and the timing especially changes, but that's essentially the game plan. Remember, Spring Hill was a small town, small community, and so a lot of these roads developed from dirt trails to one-lane roads to two-lane roads that now have 60,000 people traveling on them. You could potentially straighten out all the roads, so we'll talk about another intersection. Further south, there's Macklemore and Depot Street, and that intersection is not straight across, it's an offset. Everybody shakes their head and goes, we just need to straighten that out. Well, first of all, you have to buy a lot of right-of-way to straighten that out. And two, when you create straight roads, what does traffic do? Yeah, so in the old area of town, and there are some plans to currently in existence to redevelop this area, that doesn't mean tear the old buildings down, it means breathe some life into it, fix some infrastructure, and try and get us a bit more of a downtown that we really haven't had a chance at between the fires and the tornado. And we've talked about the roads. If anything happens with the roads, several of them may become one-ways, because that will help with traffic flow and keep traffic slow. If you straighten out these roads, you can have people shooting straight across. And when you go to a lot of old town areas, the roads aren't straight. It's just not the way they develop.
Just to add to that, the church across the street gained some side yard when they straightened that part out. That was very good for them, I'm sure it's not their property, but still.
It's not. It's actually TDOT's right of way.
Doesn't really
So they gain. The flip to that is that Mount Hope on the opposite side lost. Now Mount Hope is actually, it's a newer building, but for context, it is actually one of the oldest congregations in town, along with St. Mark's off of Murray Hill. We're working hard with the library and through some of the groups at the library to acknowledge the histories of these churches. It's very easy to look at a lot of the buildings on Main Street and realize that they're not that old. But when you've had Mother Nature wallop you several times, that doesn't mean there's not history here. Right? So, good questions. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The house next door, is there any possibility of ever buying that property, using it for parking expansion or anything?
The short answer is no. The positive answer is that Mr. Cantrell will always allow us to use that house. That house, the Purple House, as it's commonly known in town, is actually not as old as most people think. It was built in the 1920s by a man named Martin Langley.
Have we ever used it?
No, but at some stage, many years ago, long before Bill and I were gray-headed, we did try to buy it. This was before Mr. Cantrell owned it, and my version of the short story is that we needed a little help from the diocese, and they were very slow to react, and it got sold. But I don't think Mr. Cantrell will ever not allow us to use that space. And if Beechcroft opens up for parking, somehow parking is always a concern here, and yet we always find a way to make it work. I don't think we've ever had, unless you have an exceptionally large funeral here, we just find a way to make it work. So, no, he's not going to sell it. And for those that are asking when he does it do any inheritance, he is actually doing something right here. Slowly but surely, he's been working on the backside. He tells me that the inside has been stripped to the studs. Mr. Cantrell has a very diverse business interests, and so like Alicia Fitts, he can go in one direction and then wind up going a completely different direction. So I would
noticed it was like light here and lavender here, like they're in the midst of painting it.
So the reason that it became the Purple House, again, the sort of relatively short story, Sharon Cantrell, Terry's wife, was a long-time educator in Maury County. In fact, she was the principal at the Spring Hill Elementary School. Very well regarded. She also sat on the BOMA. She said it's in the city government, and someone from the codes department, I think, came and busted her for you need to paint your house. So she got the purple paint painted in her house. So it's kind of, we have some rebellious people in Spring Hill. They like to do their own thing. So I hope that that house will continue to be worked on. You will notice Whitehall on Duplex. As you go out Duplex, there's a house that sort of sits back. That is another historic home that was actually a hospital during the Battle of Spring Hill. That sat empty for 20-something years. That was purchased a year ago maybe, and Doug is doing a lot to that house. What Doug will tell you, and I think this is true of anyone who has ever dealt with an old house, even houses built in the 60s, is that you can think it's one project, and when you get the siding off, you discover you have a completely different project. So I am perhaps a little more tolerant of Purple House stories than I used to be, because I know you can think that it's going to take a year and you're going to get everything done, and then you go down rabbit holes, literally. But thank you for asking about that house. Other questions?
You mentioned that electricity went in the 1920s. You know, when other major renovations were done, you mentioned central heating air, for example. Was the start that many siding windows for a church that was built for air conditioning?
Well, recognize that all of the memorial windows that we went through were done, I would say, from the 1970s forward. So up until then, we had the cross ventilation that was used. Yes.
I'm used to seeing buildings of that time period in churches at least double it.
No, apparently our priests like to let us sweat on a Sunday. Make sure we stay away. I'm not sure. I know that the electricity went in the 20s. I don't remember when the central heating and air went in. I want to say it was the 70s. The building in the back is an interesting structure in and of its own right. We actually had for many, many years a single wide trailer back there. that was our gathering space. It was our Sunday school space. And then a tree fell on it from our neighbor's yard. So we went and talked to Mr. Cantrell and settled it out, and I think that was the occasion where we all, I think God's come to tell us that we need to replace the single wide trailer. So we had some wonderful donors that stepped up to build a building in the back that was consistent in structure and design as to this building, which, by the way, is on the National Historic Register. And then it came to naming rights. Y'all ever notice when somebody wants to name a building, it's actually a really, really big deal? And people compete to get their names on something. In this case, we had two people who had done a lot of the funding who did not want the building named after them. So that left the church in a place of, okay, what do we do? And what the two of them, I think, eventually came up with, and what it is still called, is Faith Hall. That building was built in 2004. So Saturn had announced in 1985 everything was going to grow like gangbusters. It didn't grow like gangbusters or as quickly as people thought it would. And we had 08. Things began to get a little iffy. And my story that I tell about the name Faith Hall is that the people who had put money into it to build it on faith, that we would continue to grow. That building was built with 2 Sunday school rooms and a central gathering space. We now have a almost full-time priest who uses one of those as an office. The other one is still used as a Sunday school. And what is even more magnificent and unintentional, I will tell you, is that almost every night of the week, that building is used by some group in the community. You think about it, one of the things that we lack in some big time is gathering space. It doesn't cost you $1 million. This does not cost you $1 million. We would like for it to cost you $1 million, but it doesn't. So Faith Hall is probably the newest renovation. We were just talking tonight, we're probably looking at doing a new roof. This roof is about 25 years old, 24 years old. And as you can tell with the pitch of the roof, it's a big job to do this roof. There is pretty constant maintenance, but we have, again, always been very fortunate that when there is a need, we have individuals who will step up anonymously or with name and take care of the big stuff. Because if we had to do it as a congregation in and of ourselves, I'm not sure we could. Other questions? I'm sorry, my discussion is not as coherent as I rehearsed at home, but I get in this place and have 14 different stories.
Me again, most of what you said has been about the facility. But if you have any interesting anecdotes about,
I'm glad you asked that question. I planted those.
this church.
I'm not going to touch on the personalities that have led this church because it's raining and there might be lightning that comes through. What I will tell you is, I told you the story about the organ and cutting out the rail. There's also a story for many, many years, up until probably the early 80s maybe, we kept the doors unlocked. And then we discovered that our communion wine was missing. Now, as my brother used to say, we're Episcopalians, so we drink the real stuff at communion. Usually pretty good stuff. And my grandmother would come in to set up communion, and the bottle would be getting emptier and emptier. So she sent my uncle up here, and Bud slept on one of these pews, and he laid out some kind of a tripwire. I still don't know exactly what it was, whether it was little fireworks or noisemakers or what it was. And so the gentleman comes in, trips the wire. Bud has his shotgun, and he marches the gentleman down the road to the jail. Okay, now the jail, anybody know where the liquor store is on Macklemore? Yeah. The jail, the brick building across the street was actually the original city hall. It was the original city hall, it was the original fire station, it was the original courtroom, and it was the original jail. And in order to have a city meeting, you would have to open that garage door up and pull the fire engine out so that they could set up chairs and have a bubble meeting. So Bud marches him down to the jail. Jail was also unusual, and it's our hope that we will have it in a fairly short time to have it on display. When you think of a jail, how would you describe a jail? Jail cell. Bars. Straight up and down, right? Mm-hmm. This actually looks like a giant woven basket with metal. Very unusual shape. The gentleman was not only stealing the wine, the rest of that story is that he would steal the wine, go into the sacristy, which is where our priests prepare, fall asleep, potentially have other bodily functions that were not appropriate for the sacristy. So it was actually a very messy kind of thing. It turns out that he was someone who worked night shift at a factory. He was an alcoholic. I don't know what happened to the gentleman, and I honestly don't know his name. Rumors, the stories that you hear in town are that he did get treatment and ended up living a long and good life. I don't know that he ever came back to the Episcopal Church. Was that the story you were referencing? Or is that a new one?
No, I don't know any others. I just surely knew some for the years.
Every Sunday that I sit in here, and I'm not here as often as I should, I often think about the stories that my grandmother could have told, and how I'm sure there were some Sundays that she sat here and went, "How am I going to get through this, priest? What am I going to do?" Ultimately, grace, I get a little goosebumps with this. Ultimately, grace is about family. It's about our relationship with Christ. It's about our relationship and our ability to translate that love of Christ, or love of God, or love of the larger universe, however you want to term it, into our hands and feet, and be good neighbors. And so along those lines, there used to be a flea market on the front lawn of the Presbyterian Church. Grace participated in that. We have, and I think we're going to try and do this year, something called the Divine Swine Barbecue. It's a pretty darn good barbecue. We have tried to have in the past concerts or gatherings. We love opening it to groups like you all. It is an extraordinary special place. And for the speaker series, it is our hope that if we can work with other folks, I'm hoping that our next session will actually be at the Presbyterian Church, which is the white church down Main Street. And if we can work with the Methodist Church across the street, we'll also do something there. I can show you slides of this at the library, but I know you know how much I feel for sitting in the sanctuary. Other questions? I'm going to have to remember what the walls mean. I don't think I've ever been asked that. I think the other project we have, and it's 150 years, we have some joists underneath. You're not going to fall through, but we have some joists that we probably need to be looking at just because they're old. But poplar was often used for joists in these structures, and poplar doesn't rot, which is why a lot of these old buildings may look a little rough when you look at the joist, but they're actually in pretty good shape. So, Bill, Charles, you guys want to add anything? Peggy? Okay. Our minister emailed me today and said, "You be sure and tell people that we have service on Sunday at 10. So I'm telling you, we have service at 10. Anybody is welcome. Anybody is welcome to take communion. The Episcopal Church is, in my opinion, and I'm a lifelong cradle to grave, as they say, though further away from the grave. It is an odd combination of the Catholic liturgy with the Protestant belief system. If you don't like getting up and down, this is not the church for you. But there is something very, it's almost like meditation, the service every Sunday. And more importantly than anything, part of the reason I keep coming back or drifting back is that we have a phenomenal congregation. Now, I don't know of a church that's going to tell you that they don't have a phenomenal congregation, but we really have a phenomenal congregation, and a very supportive one at that. So, all right. Yeah?
There's an old story that Episcopals were Catholics that flunked their Latin.
I would totally agree with that. I would also argue that Episcopals not only flunk their Latin, they like to drink their wine. I don't know anything else. When I was overseas, we were in Britain for a long time, so we would go Anglican, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. I think from a personal standpoint, Christians' relationship to God is through Jesus Christ, but I've been in enough other countries to know that faith is faith. Faith is faith, and ultimately I'm pretty sure we all look the same before God. So as long as we're doing the right thing down here or trying to do the right thing, we're probably in pretty good shape. In the Episcopal Church, there's something called high church and low church. St. Peter's is high church. It's a beautiful liturgy. It's where they swing the incense, do all that stuff. It's a beautiful liturgy. I was just a part of something last night down there. Grace is what I used to consider low church. We're kind of in between. We're creeping in between. But the example that I'll give you with Grace is this. At some point in the middle of our service, after we go through certain protocols, there's something called the peace. And the traditional Episcopal peace is that you stand up in your pew and turn to the person next to you and shake your hands. The goal is to sort of clear your conscience before you go up for communion. At Grace, people pour into the pews. And we've had ministers that just made them crazy, that we wouldn't just do the basketball pivot, and instead we pour into the pews. That still continues, right, guys? You're reaching across the pews because you're genuinely glad to be in this place with these people. That to me sort of epitomizes Grace, but I've been around a long time and a little biased towards this. Did you learn anything tonight? Anybody want to come back on Sunday at 10 o'clock and that way I can tell Father Joe that I got at least one? Which thing? This?
That.
It's still light candles?
Oh, okay.
No.
It's not permanent. It's
No.
and extinguished.
No. There's something I really going to say about it here, but I would light a candle, but they don't let me near fire, so. Father Joe has been here 5 years? Close to 7. He is, being a priest is a bit like being a doctor. There's really no such thing as a part-time priest. Technically he's part-time, but he's here every Sunday. He does a Wednesday healing service. What other services does he do, guys?
He's here most of the day on Tuesday, and then when he's not writing a sermon or doing something, visiting congregants at home, especially the sick.
Pastoral care.
Okay, so they don't really take them off.
No. No, once we get a priest, they're kind of stuck with us. There was a priest here who was originally from Colombia. He grew up in this church as an acolyte. I'm sorry, Dana, I can't help it. It's too long in one place. And he came and he was what we call supply clergy. So he would come in one Sunday and another priest who happened to be female would come in the next Sunday, and they worked beautifully together. There's a story that he got a call from the senior warden, which is our mission council vestry. It said, hey, we need to let you know that we have a roof leak. This was like on a Saturday or Friday. And he goes, okay, I'll come down. She goes, oh, we don't need you. We just wanted to let you know that there may be a patch on the roof when you preach tomorrow. That's kind of what Grace has done. What is, for all that Father Joe brings to this congregation on a Sunday, what happens in this church is largely in the hands and the feet of the people who sit in the pews that you're sitting in. Now, Father Joe might not like me saying that, but he also knows I would say it, so. Other questions? Okay, so for the speaker series, we are working on next month. It is the 4th Thursday. As I said, I sincerely hope that we can do it at the Presbyterian Church so that we can be inside that beautiful building. That beautiful building is a little bit younger, but that beautiful building also has some interesting ties. This church is tied to William McKissick and the McKissick family from the brick house next door. The Presbyterian Church is tied to Oaklawn. Does everybody know where Oaklawn is?
Yes.
Yeah, on Denning Road. Frederick Thompson, I believe was the gentleman's name, was a minister at the Presbyterian Church. The Chairs family from Ripavilla were members there. And so part of why we wanted to do these church sessions was to help you understand how some of the names in town are tied to these entities. Spring Hill was truly, it took a village to create a village. And so understanding those names and those ties and the ties to homes, particularly since we've walked so many of them, is one of our goals. We are also hoping, and this is down the path, so Dana may kill me for throwing me out there. On Maury Hill, everybody know where Maury Hill is? There is a building that looks like if you touched it, it would fall over. I look at the face that she's making. St. Mark's, that building was built about 1900. It was an African American school. Prior to that, that congregation dated to just after the Civil War. That church has been out of function for probably 20 years. We are working to renovate and restore that church. It will likely not be a church per se. We hope that it will be a gathering place for African American history. So at some stage, I would like to say in a year, and I may be throwing myself under the bus for this, Dana's like, please don't say that. We would like to at least have you look at pictures of the inside and what's there. It's a very simple church, but it's a very extraordinary place. The baptisms at St. Mark's on Sundays, it was an all-day Sunday service, and the baptisms on Sunday took place. They would walk from St. Mark's over to McCutcheon Creek on Old Miles Johnson, and that's where they did their baptisms. People still alive today can remember on Sunday seeing all of the women of the church, the mothers of the church, dressed in white. Those folks who, for the most part, didn't have a lot, would take Thanksgiving meals to family who needed meals. The faith in this community, and I think this is probably true of many, but the faith in this community has been less about which structure you worshiped in than how you exhibited it in your community. So that's what I would leave you with. We're done if everybody has done it. Nobody has any questions. Thank you for turning that off. I do want to be sure